My husband hugged me goodbye and said he was leaving for Toronto for a 2-year assignment, and I stood there in tears watching him go. I played my part perfectly, the loving wife who believed every word. But the moment I walked back into that empty house, everything inside me shifted. Without hesitation, I transferred every dollar from our $650,000 savings and filed for divorce. Because what he didn't know was that I had already discovered the truth he thought he'd hidden so well. And this time, he was the one walking into a trap. The airport terminal at O'Hare was a blur of movement and noise, but the world felt like it was shrinking down to just the two of us. I held Mark's hand with a desperation that made my knuckles white, tears streaming down my face in a rhythmic, uncontrollable flow that I hoped looked like heartbreak. My voice was a jagged whisper as I asked him if he really had to be gone for 2 whole years, the words catching in my throat as if I couldn't breathe. Mark reached out, his fingers tracing the path of my tears as he wiped them away with a look of practiced reluctance that I now saw for exactly what it was. He told me I knew how vital this project was for his career, promising that the time would fly by and that we would video call constantly. I buried my face into his chest, inhaling the scent of his cologne one last time, while he patted my back and called me a silly girl. He spoke about our future, claiming that when he returned, we would finally have the money for a down payment on a house in a neighborhood we actually wanted. When the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Mark leaned down and pressed a deep kiss against my forehead, telling me to wait for him. I stood there, a frozen statue in the middle of the bustling crowd, watching his silhouette get smaller as he moved through the security checkpoint. My vision blurred, and the travelers rushing past ignored the weeping woman standing alone in the corner. I finally wiped my eyes with a crumpled tissue, took a shaky breath, and turned to leave. In the back of the Uber, I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar streets of Chicago streak past in a gray haze. The driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror and asked if I was seeing off a boyfriend or a husband. I told him it was my husband, and he sighed, remarking on how difficult it was for young couples to be apart for work, but assuring me that a good man always comes back. I offered a faint, hollow smile and said nothing more. When I arrived at our condo in Lincoln Park, the silence of the empty apartment felt heavy. I stood in the entryway, looking at the pair of slippers Mark had left by the door, and a bitter, sharp laugh escaped my lips. I kicked off my heels and walked barefoot into the living room, sinking onto the sofa. I pulled my phone from my purse and opened my banking app, staring at the balance of our joint account, $650,482.17. This was the sum of 5 years of marriage, a life built on my paychecks being deposited directly into his hands. He had always said it was better for financial management, and because I trusted the man I married, I never questioned it. That trust had died exactly 3 days ago. That afternoon, I had left work early, planning to surprise him. As I approached our building, I saw him walking out of a cafe down the street, but he wasn't alone. A woman had her arm linked intimately through his, and they were laughing with a familiarity that made my blood run cold. I froze, hiding behind a large oak tree as I watched him hail a cab for her. Before she climbed inside, Mark leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. The air felt thin, and my heart felt as if it were being crushed in a vice. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I took the long way home and waited. When he arrived that night, he acted as if nothing had happened, claiming he had a late meeting. I fought the urge to pull away when he kissed my cheek, instead telling him I had saved him a plate of dinner. As I watched him eat, he looked like a complete stranger. He brought up the Toronto project as an afterthought later that evening. He spoke with wide-eyed excitement about leading a once-in-a-lifetime project that would guarantee him a vice presidency. When I asked what would happen to me, he wrapped his arms around me and told me to keep working here while he sent money for expenses. In that moment, the lie was transparent. I knew he wasn't going for work, he was going for her. The next day, I hired a private investigator named Kevin Vance. He was professional and direct, and when I told him what I saw, he promised a full report within a week. He warned me that the truth could be harsh, but I told him I needed to know, no matter the cost. For the next few days, I lived a double life. I played the role of the doting wife, cooking dinner and chatting about our day, while my heart felt cold and dead inside. Mark was so absorbed in his secret excitement that he never noticed the shift in me. A week later, Kevin handed me a manila envelope in a quiet coffee shop. The photos inside were like physical blows, Mark holding hands with the woman on Michigan Avenue, checking into hotels, and dining at high-end restaurants. Her name was Claire Sutton, the new marketing director at his company. They had been together for 3 months. Kevin revealed that they weren't just going for a trip, they were immigrating. Mark had already used our joint savings to buy a condo in Toronto. The file even contained screenshots of their messages. They spoke about me as if I were a hurdle to be cleared. Mark told her that once I was settled, they could be together openly. He bragged about moving the money and claimed I wouldn't be able to do anything because I had no personal savings left. He planned to leave, wait 6 months, and then tell me he had met someone else to avoid a scene. I closed the file and looked at Kevin with a newfound firmness. I told him I was going to transfer every penny out of that joint account. It was a joint account, and since most of that money was my salary, I had every right. I went straight to the bank from the coffee shop. The teller was hesitant because of the large sum, but I entered my PIN and watched the screen flash with a successful transfer. $650,000 was moved to my personal account. It was the physical manifestation of my blood, sweat, and tears from the last 5 years. When I got back home, I sat on the sofa and thought about how we met. He had been charming and stable, pursuing me with flowers and sweet words until I was swept off my feet. We were married a year later. I thought I was happy, but now I saw the cracks I had ignored. He had controlled the finances, stayed out late with loud background noises on the phone, and avoided my family. I had made 1,000 excuses for him, but the joke was on me. When Mark came home at 8 p.m. on his final night, I suppressed my disgust. He reminded me to save money while he was gone and not to spend recklessly. I almost laughed. He talked about buying a big house and having a baby when he returned, a baby he clearly intended to have with Claire. That night, I lay next to him in bed, unable to sleep, knowing he was ready to run off with my life's work. The next morning at the airport, I used extra makeup to make my fake crying look more dramatic. I played the part of the heartbroken wife until he disappeared through the gate. Once he was gone, I didn't rush. I went home, showered, and changed into a simple, dignified navy dress. I looked at the determined woman in the mirror and felt the naive girl of 5 years ago finally vanish. I messaged Kevin to keep tracking Mark in Toronto and then messaged a lawyer named Miss Davis. When I met her at 2 p.m., she explained that the case would be complex since he was now abroad, but she assured me that my transfer of the funds was legally sound. I signed the divorce petition, detailing his infidelity and the theft of marital assets. As I walked home from the law firm, I felt a sense of relief. I began packing Mark's things into boxes, his clothes, his books, every reminder of the life he had tried to steal from me. Each item I touched only deepened my resolve to see this through to the end. I spent the next several days packing Mark's life into cardboard boxes, meticulously folding his clothes and stacking his books as if I were burying a ghost. I planned to ship everything to his parents. If they were proud of the man they had raised, they could deal with the physical remnants of his deception. While I was taping the final box shut, my phone vibrated on the counter. It was Mark. I took a deep, steadying breath to settle the rage in my chest before answering. He sounded breathless and excited, announcing that he had finally landed in Toronto. I forced my voice into a neutral, slightly weary tone, asking if the flight had been all right. He complained about the jet lag, but mentioned the weather was nice, then asked if I had cried a lot after he left. I told him I was okay and suggested he get some rest. Before hanging up, he told me he loved me. I paused for a long heartbeat, the irony thick enough to choke on, before echoing the sentiment. I stared at the call log and laughed. He didn't love me. He loved the idea of a gullible woman who would fund his new life without asking questions. The apartment slowly began to transform. As I cleared out his belongings, rearranged the furniture, and tore down every photograph of us, the space started to feel like mine again. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel lonely, it felt like freedom. 5 days later, Miss Davis called with news that the petition had been filed and accepted by the court. She was impressed by my documentation, noting that my thoroughness had allowed the process to move quickly. She explained that the court would now issue a summons for Mark, and if he failed to respond within the deadline, we could move for a default judgment. I hung up the phone and finally let out the breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. That night, Mark initiated a video call. The background was a stylish, unfamiliar room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a shimmering city skyline. He panned the camera around, bragging about the apartment the company had supposedly arranged for him. I sneered internally, knowing this was the condo he had purchased with my life savings. He told me it was a perfect one-bedroom but felt empty without me. It took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh in his face. He was likely living there with Claire at that very moment, yet he was still performing this elaborate charade. I played along, telling him we'd be together again when he returned. After the call ended, I sat in a daze, stunned by his acting skills. If I hadn't seen the investigator's proof, I might have been fooled for the rest of my life. A week later, Kevin delivered a fresh report. The new photos showed Mark and Claire living a domestic fantasy in Toronto. They were grocery shopping, cooking together, and taking romantic walks like newlyweds. One photo showed them at a real estate agency, apparently looking at a house in Vancouver and planning to take out a mortgage in his company's name. I forwarded everything to Miss Davis. She immediately suggested filing a motion to freeze his assets to prevent him from funneling any more of our marital property into his new life. I told her to move forward without hesitation. She promised to get me the best possible outcome, expressing her own disdain for men who treated their wives like bank accounts. 2 weeks later, the reality of my retaliation finally hit him. Mark called me that night, his voice no longer sweet or comforting, but vibrating with pure rage. He demanded to know if I was insane and why I had filed for divorce. I answered him calmly, stating that I knew everything about him and Claire. There was a stunned silence on the other end before he tried to play dumb, his voice lacing with panic as he asked what I was talking about. I told him to stop the act. I told him I knew Toronto wasn't for work, that I knew about the condo, and that I knew he never intended to come back. He tried to start an explanation, but I cut him off, telling him I'd see him in court. The mask finally slipped. He screamed at me, accusing me of having no right to transfer the money from our joint account since it was marital property. I retorted that since the vast majority of that money was my hard-earned salary, I had every right to protect it. I asked him if using marital funds to buy a secret house in another country wasn't the definition of hiding assets. He went silent, then threatened that I would regret this and get nothing from the divorce. I told him we would see about that and hung up. My hands were trembling, and despite my preparation, the confrontation left a lingering ache in my chest. In the days that followed, he alternated between begging for forgiveness and sending threatening messages. I blocked out the noise and focused on the lawsuit. A month later, the court hearing took place. Mark didn't return to the country, choosing to be represented by a lawyer instead. Miss Davis was a force of nature in the courtroom, presenting the photos of the affair, the records of the illegal asset transfers, and my salary history from the last 5 years. Mark's lawyer tried to argue the photos were doctored and the Toronto property was a simple investment, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When the verdict finally arrived on a beautiful, sunny day, Miss Davis called with the news. The court had ruled entirely in my favor. I was awarded the full balance of the joint account, half the value of the Toronto property, and $75,000 in damages for emotional distress. I broke down in tears of pure relief. I was finally legally free. I celebrated that night with my closest friends, Sarah and Emily. We toasted to my freedom, and while they expressed their anger at his betrayal, I realized I was ready to let the past stay in the past. I was done wasting my time on people who weren't worth it. Life after the divorce was nothing like the misery I had feared. I didn't spend my nights crying. I felt liberated. I redecorated the condo in vibrant colors, started yoga, and began cooking the foods I liked instead of catering to Mark's preferences. I traveled to places I had only ever dreamed of, realizing the world was much larger than a failed marriage. 6 months later, Mark's mother tracked me down. She begged me to forgive him, claiming he was just confused and had been seduced by a harlot. She told me he had broken up with Claire and wanted to come back. I laughed coldly, asking if the breakup happened because the court ordered him to pay me and left him broke. Her face went pale. I told her that while I understood she was hurting for her son, our marriage was over and she should never look for me again. I walked away without looking back. Eventually, I met Ben Carter at work. He was mature and kind, and when he eventually asked me out, he was honest about his feelings. I told him I wasn't ready, and he promised to wait for me. A year later, once the court judgment was fully enforced and I had nearly $1 million in savings, I opened a cozy coffee shop. It became my sanctuary. One afternoon, a haggard, graying version of Mark walked in to apologize. I looked at him and realized I didn't even hate him anymore. He simply wasn't worth the energy. When he asked if I was happy, I told him I was happier than I had ever been with him. Seeing him leave, I felt no sting, only peace. I eventually gave Ben a chance, and while our love isn't a whirlwind of drama, it is built on a steady stream of respect and freedom. I recently heard Mark is broke and alone in Toronto, begging for money. I simply blocked the number. I am not a recycling bin for his baggage. I am a woman who finally learned how to love herself. I watched the young girl leave the coffee shop, her chin held a little higher after our talk. It struck me then that perhaps the true purpose of my pain was to act as a bridge for others, helping them cross over from their own heartbreak into growth. But just as I felt I had finally mastered my own narrative, the past came knocking with a violence I didn't expect. 3 months later, while I was closing out the register, an unknown number flashed on my phone. It was Officer Chen from the Toronto Police Service. My heart skipped a beat as she informed me that Mark had been arrested for massive investment fraud and embezzlement. He had been running a Ponzi scheme for years, totaling over $20 million. Worse, he had left a letter for me, confessing that the property I now partially owned was bought with stolen funds. The Crown was moving to seize it. My hand began to shake as the officer delivered the final blow. Mark had stated in his letter that he never loved me. He had married me solely as a financial mark. The officer's voice faded into a hum as a call from Ben beeped through. I managed to tell her I understood before hanging up, but before I could answer Ben, the shop door burst open. A frantic, disheveled man rushed in, screaming that he was one of Mark's creditors. He demanded I pay back a $5 million debt, claiming that as Mark's former wife, it was my burden to carry. I forced myself to remain like stone. I told him calmly that we were divorced and that I would need to see a promissory note proving the debt was incurred for our shared living expenses during the marriage. He was stunned by my composure. Before he could escalate, Ben rushed in, positioning himself as a shield between us. Ben threatened to call the police, and the man finally retreated, snarling that he would see me in court. I collapsed into Ben's arms, the brave face I'd put on finally cracking. He held me tightly, promising to protect me, but the officer's words, that Mark had never loved me, echoed in the hollows of my mind. The next day, Ben walked me into Miss Davis's office. She listened to the chaos and offered a steadying perspective. She explained that under marital law, debt incurred by one spouse for private interests or illegal activities is not joint marital debt. Since Mark had been running a scam, the burden was on the creditors to prove I had benefited, which they couldn't. Regarding the Canadian condo, she assured me that as a good-faith third party who had received the asset through a legal divorce settlement without knowledge of the crime, my share was protected. However, she warned me that more creditors might come. And they did. For weeks, people showed up with forged notes and demands. Each time, I stood my ground, demanding proof they didn't have. It took a toll. The shop's business dipped as scenes were made, and I felt constantly on edge. Ben suggested moving or closing the shop temporarily, but I refused. I wouldn't let Mark's ghost destroy the life I had built with my own hands. A month later, a breakthrough came from the Canadian authorities. They confirmed I was a victim of Mark's deception, not a participant. My assets were cleared of any seizure. Miss Davis successfully batted away the remaining creditors, and the shop finally returned to a place of peace. But the police called one last time, offering me a chance to speak to Mark. I hesitated, then agreed. His voice was weak and frail, stripped of the arrogance he once held. He admitted everything. He confessed he had sought me out because I was kind, stable, and naive, a perfect tool for his investments. He claimed he eventually grew to love me, but his greed had won. I told him that I didn't hate him for the money anymore, but for the 5 years he treated my heart like a pawn in a game. I thanked him for the lesson, hung up, and realized that was the last time he would ever occupy a second of my life. I spent that night talking to Ben about the future. He told me he wanted to marry me, to give me the real home I deserved. I told him I wanted that too, but I needed time to ensure our love was built on respect, not just a need for rescue. He promised to wait as long as it took. In that waiting period, I flourished. I hired Chloe and Maria to help with the shop, giving me time to pursue photography and writing. I wrote about my journey for magazines, and soon, letters from women all over the country flooded in. I replied to every single one, telling them that leaving a lie is not a failure, it is a rebirth. I told them that a woman's worth isn't defined by the man she stands next to, but by the strength she finds when she stands alone. Last winter, on a biting cold day in Chicago, Ben took me to the beach. As the waves crashed against the shore, he dropped to one knee and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. He promised he wasn't Mark, that he would never lie, never betray, and never hurt me. I didn't need him to wait any longer. I said yes. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair filled with genuine blessings. My mother cried, relieved to see a light in my eyes that had been missing for years. Ben and I moved through life in a steady, gentle stream. He respected my career, helped at the coffee shop, and never asked me to be anything other than exactly who I was. When I found out I was pregnant this spring, the joy was unlike anything I'd ever felt. This child was a symbol of a love that was healthy and true. During my 5th month, a letter arrived from Mark's mother. She apologized for her son and said he was reforming himself in prison, sending his wishes for my happiness. I wrote back, telling her I had forgiven the past. I had let the weight of it go because I realized that holding on to anger only anchors you to the person who hurt you. Last fall, our daughter Clara was born. Holding her, I looked back at the girl who had stood crying at the airport 5 years ago. I realized that woman had to walk through the fire so she could raise this little girl to be strong, independent, and kind. Now, my days are a beautiful cycle of caring for Clara and running my shop. I am an independent woman who no longer depends on anyone for her identity. Last month, I hosted an event at the shop for women struggling with their own marriages. I shared my story, looking at Ben holding our daughter by the door, and told them that they could be happy again too. This 5-year journey, from being a victim of a scam to becoming a guide for others, all started with one brave decision to walk away and file for divorce. I have no regrets. I am no longer lost. I found myself, and in doing so, I found a life worth living. Thank you for listening to my journey. I'll see you in the next story.